A lot of the way that I think about the current project of the techno-progressive project is what is the relationship between our thinking about the future and the imminence of certain kinds of technological changes and our moral and political life. The more I think about it in terms of the Enlightenment as a set of memes, a set of values and ideas, and different movements and time periods have different valences for those different values. So one of those values, one of those beliefs that came out of the Enlightenment was the kind of transmutation of Christian eschatology into a narrative of progress. The idea that we were inexorably going to move towards more social, moral, political, and technological progress. And that there was a feedback, a positive feedback loop between our technological progress and our social progress. I think that's a pretty core commitment for techno-progressives, but and for people who, certainly for transhumanists in general, but it also is undercut and has always been undercut by the Enlightenment commitment to empiricism, which is that we have no guarantees that anything's going to turn right, turn out right. It could be that liberal democracy, the kinds of freedoms that we've learned to expect over the last 100 years were a brief interlude in a human history that's been dominated by various kinds of caste and class oppression. And it could be that the forms of authoritarianism, the Chinese form of authoritarianism, the neo-fascist forms of authoritarianism that we promoted, those could be our future, right? So empirically, there's the myth of progress, the narrative of progress has nothing underpinning it except our faith. It's a good faith to have. It's an optimistic faith. It keeps us moving forward. If we thought that the future was just going to be a boot on the face, it wouldn't be very, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it's funny because even as you, like, I asked the question and I don't like the answer. It's funny because, as you said, I find myself like summoning FM up who would have been like, yes, but, and there would have been a big but. Like, there are lots of benchmarks that we can point to that show progress. I mean, even now as we decry, terrible racism in the United States and entrenched classism and various horrible jingo. I mean, we say it all the time, but yet there are benchmarks, and it's funny because I sort of expected that from you rather than from me. But so it's looking at these benchmarks and milestones, but also looking at the social environment.
Well, I think that's the key, is that there are some people in the futurist, transhumanist milieu who definitely are unquestioning devotees of a narrative of progress. They don't think that, they don't take a lot of apocalyptic or dystopian anxieties seriously. And then there are those of us who take them seriously, think that those could be outcomes of future human history, and say, no, we have to take these seriously so we don't end up there, and so that we end up over here, and this other over here could be this utopian place. Now, when we say that, our critics think that we're just utopians, that we're just committed to the narrative of progress. And I think your distinction is absolutely correct. It's like there's a very important difference between saying it's possible that we could get to this great place and saying it's absolutely certain that that's where things are headed. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that although for micro-political reasons, the San Francisco Silicon Valley milieu of transhumanism is distinctly libertarian. The dominant politics of the transhumanist movement has been cosmopolitan, Enlightenment cosmopolitanism, a defense of science and technology, empiricism, secularism, individual liberty, reproductive freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So really the dimensions that we're fighting, I think, are increasingly falling out, so that the culturally conservative forces are seeing the things that we've thought about as in terms of transhumanism as an enemy. And increasingly, the people on the liberal side of the dimension will be forced to defend these kinds of technological empowerments. throughout my interventions into futurism over the last 25 years, one of the overriding themes is that most futurists, like most people, are ahistorical. They don't understand history. And if you look at the history of technological expectations, you see the same stories over and over again. You know, when the telegraph wires are being strung across the United States 150 years ago, people were saying this will be the end of war. When people in Beijing can instantly communicate with people in New York, why would people fight wars? And it's like, well, so, you know, these same expectations and these same pessimisms, you know, you see right before every major technological breakthrough, people saying that technological breakthrough is impossible. No one will ever buy it. No one will ever need it. So at any rate, I think ahistoricity in terms of politics and ahistoricity in terms of technology really doesn't serve us very well. If you look at the history of political things, certain themes keep coming back up. And, you know, when capitalism goes into crisis and people tend to get riled up about immigration and cultural minorities and they get scapegoated, these things come up over and over again. So yeah, I do believe, let me just say, I have defended Pinker to my students and my peers. I think Pinker, you know who I'm talking about, Steven Pinker, he's an advocate for a model of progress which is empirically based. I do think it's absolutely true that our contemporary society, the risk of dying a violent death is distinctly lower than it was for our ancestors, and it's gotten lower every century that we can measure. That's progress, and I'm glad to live in a society where I have an 80-year life expectancy instead of a 30-year life expectancy, where I'm literate instead of illiterate, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe that all those things are legitimate if you define them as progress. But as I say to my students, ISIS doesn't think they're progress, right? Not everybody agrees that those are progress, right? If your definition of progress is how much we're living according to Sharia, then all of those things are relevant. So there's no self-evident nature to the progress that we adduce, right?